we're okay to get started. Are you guys good with that? Since I'm doing intros anyway, and that's not the interesting part, I will get that part started now.
Okay. Oh, yeah, very
So
important.
there you go. For those of you who have joined us already, I am Diana de Jesus Medina. I am the Chief of External Strategy and Affairs at Latino Justice. And somehow I drew like the short straw, no, the good straw, the longest straw in this convening because I get to introduce two all Latina panels, and that is just like right up my alley. So today we are in reimagining systems of enforcement, and we are joined by four remarkable Latinas whose work I hugely admire and whose insights I cannot wait to hear today. So first off, we have our moderator, Maritza Perez, who is Director of National Affairs at Drug Policy Alliance. And Maritza is leading the federal legislative agenda and strategy for DPA. She was previously with the Center for American Progress and MALDEF and has a wealth of experience on issues of drug policy, policing, and prison and sentencing reform, among other things. Um, Maritza is joined today by Eunisses Hernandez, who is the executive director and co-founder of La Defensa. And Eunisses is a policy advocate, campaign strategist, the daughter of immigrants, who knows firsthand the impacts of that criminalization has on immigrant populations and on people of color. She's a leader in efforts to develop sentencing reform and abolitionist policies, and I'm super excited to hear what Eunisses has to share. Sandra Rodriguez is Senior Program Specialist at Restorative Justice Project. Sandra has a background in restorative justice research, education, advocacy, circle keeping, community organizing and training, and the implementation of community based pre charge restorative justice diversion programs. Sandra is dedicated to collective healing and liberation, and that just makes my heart sing. Alejandra Pablos, Ale. Ale is a nationally recognized community organizer and activist. She is at the intersection of reproductive justice, mass incarceration, and immigration spaces. And Ale has been battling deportation, if I understand correctly, for over a decade, doing so as one kick ass activist and leader focused on autonomy and self determination. I mean, the epitome of Latina power. So, without further ado, let's get to this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for that really great introduction. I'm also excited to be on this badass panel full of Latina chingonas. I gotta say, I was very intentional about that. But also because we know the great work that you guys have been doing. And I know that this could be such a great opportunity to share your knowledge, your wealth of experience with our audience. So as you know, this panel is entitled Reimagining Systems of Enforcement. And this is really what it's going to be. I really want us to imagine different ways of doing things in this panel. I want us to have a conversation, an exploratory conversation about what we mean when we say that we want to do things in a different way, when we want to reimagine systems, including what we mean when we talk about abolition and defunding the police. These conversations have become more mainstream, especially after the George Floyd uprising in 2020. But these conversations are not new. They've been happening actually for decades. I think the fact that they're more mainstream actually gives us a really great opportunity to bring in new people and talk to them about what we mean when we say that there's really another way to do things. So to start off, I wanted to just kick a question to the audience, and our panelists obviously can join in. But I want to hear from you guys to put your imagination hats on and share, what do you guys envision? What do you imagine when you think about liberation and justice for your communities? And please write your responses in the chat so we can all take a look at what people are thinking. Panelists, you're obviously welcome to do this as well. And our audience, again, the question is, what do you think of? What do you imagine when you think about liberation and justice for your communities? I see resources to address harm, decriminalizing nonviolent behavior, more non-system responses than system responses. Free movement, I want to see folks being able to travel across the world, decriminalizing survival acts such as sex work, full human dignity to live, breathe, play, and work in healthy and resilient communities of their choice. Liberation for me means no cages and freedom to be yourself and make your own decisions. No cages. A criminal justice system that turns towards restorative justice and alternatives to incarceration first. Local community interventions for violent crimes. These are all really beautiful responses. They're responses that are really grounded in humanity and love.
Yeah, we have so much work to do because we have so much love to share. Love it.
These are all really, really great responses. Life affirming responses, investments in the community and social environmental programs, and not policing military. Beautiful. All of this, yes. So, I wanted to pose that question first because I wanted us to, just start brainstorming what alternative systems could look like. I mean, you guys have attended this whole conference on why the criminal legal system in its current form has failed us. But I want this to be a conversation on where we go from here. What is already happening in our communities? What can we continue to build upon? So again, this is a exploratory conversation, understanding that not everyone has engaged with this issue as deep as others have. So our first question to the panel, and I want to hear from each of you about this. What are some alternatives to incarceration that you all have worked on in your localities? And that could be in the criminal justice context or in the immigration context. And whoever wants to kick it off, go ahead.
Okay, well, I unmuted myself first. I can go first. Hey, everyone. My name is Alejandra. I use pronouns she and hers. I'm out here in Tohono O'odham area, Tucson, Arizona. And I think for me, I really like this question. And I was just kind of like, okay, yeah, what are some of the things I've really learned from, right, that are intersecting at criminal justice and immigration? And I think I'm really just even proud of the narrative work we did locally here in Arizona around defunding the police. I think, one thing that was very clear is that defunding the police then equals less deportations, right? Less ICE collaborations. So a lot of our communities understood immediately, right, that we need to defund the police. I think a lot of our communities are already abolitionists in the sense of we don't want to call the police, right? And I think good comes from that, right? Those are they come here after maybe the harm has happened, right? And we want to actually get to the root of things. So I think I'm really just excited. I actually joined the George Floyd uprising. I realized I can't go out and protest because I know I'm gonna get arrested. I already know. I stick out like a sore thumb. Just look at me. Everywhere I go. And I think I decided to stay home and organize with other artists, other creatives, other folks, to really uplift the messages through printing, screen printing, shirts and posters and all the swag and the propaganda that we needed to start talking about Black Lives Matter and defunding the police and what that meant to us and what we wanted to really invest in, right? And talking about who has that money, right? The police have that money, right? And all that stuff. So I really appreciate that. I really love, obviously, I think mutual aid work also sits at those intersections, right? If we're talking about how do we take care of each other, right? Basically, how do we take care of each other? We want no prisons, no cages, right? What does that mean, right? We have to start creating collectives, cooperatives, right? Taking care of each other and really being there for each other. So yeah, I think I could pass it on to Eunisses or Sandra with that.
I'm happy to go next. It always takes me a minute to unmute myself. Hi, everybody. My name is Sandra Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm calling in from just outside of the Bay Area in Northern California. And I will talk about restorative justice as some of the work that I've done regarding, you know, alternatives to incarceration. And I'll say that because RJ looks a lot of different ways. So, you know, speaking specifically to the work I've been doing for the last several years, it's restorative justice diversion. And that is pre-charge for the most part. So this is diversion that happens before charges are filed against somebody. And most of the programs that we work with are for young people, although some of them have expanded to young adults, and some others have actually started at the point of adult diversion. And what that looks like is that instead of the district attorney's office filing charges against someone, they instead are able to be diverted to a community-based restorative justice diversion program where they have the opportunity to work with RJ facilitators, talk about what happened, what needs have come up for both, you know, the person that caused harm and the one that experienced it, discuss root causes, and ultimately come together to talk about all of those things with each other and then form a plan for how the person that caused the harm is going to make things right with their family, the person that they harmed, their community, and themselves. And this is all within the container of healing and accountability in a non-punitive and fully community-based form that is fully outside of the system, which I think is really important to keep at the forefront, is that communities know what they need, they know how to heal, the solutions already exist there, and we just need to support and uplift that becoming a reality and becoming more accessible to folks and communities.
I wanted to just kind of like talk a little bit about just what you shared, Sandra, because I think sometimes too, even this title of reimagining systems of enforcement, I'm like, what an oxymoron, you know, or it just makes me think, right? Like, I'm like, do I want to reimagine enforcement? But even like how much co-opting happens within the criminal justice, even the legal system, right? Around restorative justice. And how like we are not going to heal through the oppressor's hands, right, either. And like, so I wanted to actually if you can, I mean, I don't know if we'll talk about this actually more later, my bad, but it always just gets to me sometimes, again, when we're thinking like around restorative justice, and like it's like restore to what, right? And I'm sure you're going to talk about transformative justice later too, but just wanted to be like mindful that sometimes, you know, working within the systems doesn't always bring justice either. And I really appreciate like how you're always bringing in the aspects of like it has to be outside of the system. So these things can also happen without actually, right, like working with like hand in hand with the police, you know, but the police just, you know, be there all the time.
Absolutely. Lots more to say. I'll definitely pass it to Eunisses, but for sure, so much more to say on that. Thank you, Alejandra.
Yeah, that was such a good point, Ale. Thanks for raising that.
Yes, thank you, Ale. That's really, really important, especially when we're thinking about alternatives to incarceration, right? Because for me, a lot of it is preventing, even from like having law enforcement or the carceral system have access to our people. And so like that's the little bit of the lens that I'll bring is, yes, alternatives to incarceration doesn't mean replacing one thing with another. Sometimes it's just like letting our people go or just not criminalizing our folks for things. And so when you know, earlier when you asked that question, Maritza, of what I imagine that community, it's like, well, I wish my community just looked like the rich communities, where if you needed access to mental health care, you can go get it at a private facility. Or if you had problematic substance use, you could go to a facility in your neighborhood and get services like rich people and celebrities do. So like the communities that we imagine, they exist. They just aren't our communities. And what that looks like, I mean, and it looks like that because of the capitalistic infrastructure that we exist in, where the money is. When we fight for things, when we fight for alternatives here in LA County, because I'm on Tonga land in LA and LA County, you know, they always tell us like, oh, we don't have money for more housing. We don't have money to build out drug treatment or mental health services, but you got money for more jails. Like, why? And so when, you know, for me, thinking about this question and thinking about alternatives, it's building out mental health services, building out drug treatment, repealing laws that criminalize people for different acts of survival and problematic issues like problematic substance use or even mental health. And then even then, it's also reimagining this system that currently provides services because it's not trauma informed for the most part. In LA County, when you look at the departments that get sued, the Department of Mental Health is the second department that gets sued right after the Department of the Sheriffs. And that's because you know, these systems are still harmful. And so we even when we reimagine like the prevention and the services and community support, it cannot be another iteration of a carceral system. It cannot be a place where we're strip searching people, where we're chaining them down. It has to be a place that's restorative and actually invest in the person, because people always come back. They're going to come back to our communities for the most part. When you look at the data, a significant amount of people come back home. And so how do we invest in people that, and I'm not saying invest in prisons, but how do we invest in people that have caused harm and also keep people safe that have been harmed? But that's a great question, Mercy. Thank you.
And Eunisses, can you speak to a current example in LA that I know for a fact that you've worked on?
Yes. So, you know, the LA County wanted to build 2 new jails and we stopped them. But in order to stop them, we actually had to develop a plan with them. So I'll put in the link, but it's called the Care First, Jails Last. For us, when we came, we're like Care First, Jails Never. And so when you look at this report, there's 114 recommendations broken up in a spectrum saying, you know, intercept 0 through 1, no law enforcement responses. This is what we have to invest in to keep the system away from our people. And then everywhere else, we need to create safety valves to get people out of the system that have already been sucked in. And so it's keeping people out and getting people out that are already in. And that's actual policy that we're working on. It's the department that LA County has created. It's an Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative department. But let me also take a step back and say, we can pass all the beautiful policies we want. We can win the campaigns, but it's in implementation where the system tries to stay the same, where the system tries to keep its money. And when I say the system, it's the harmful systems, right, that we're trying to change or move money out of. And so even though there's an Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative, it's not implementing things in the vision that we had developed our report in. You know, trying to get women out of the LA County jail with ankle monitors that would put them under the responsibility of the sheriffs, which would mean more people would be exposed to the sheriff's department, who's already having harm in many of these other places. So I think even then, we have wins, and implementation is the key, where you have to really just fight. That we're fighting now. That's what we're battling, but we're gonna win because we're not gonna stop fighting.
I know that's right. California, the history of California, just like, again, the people, the identities there, all the history of criminalization. That's why y'all are so bold in things that you're doing, like seeing even like policies like, or attempts like to pass the Vision Act around, like, you know, stopping ICE transfers. Super huge, right? Like that's an alternative to being incarcerated again, right? This double punishment system. And I'm always just looking towards all the organizing happening in Cali. I'm in Arizona, but I'm always in LA and California, just trying to get that Kisamaga rub off on us and bring it back to Arizona, you know? So yeah, shout outs to y'all organizers over there.
Thank you. We're all learning from each other, right? That's the only way that we can succeed. So we're not recreating the wheel.
So you guys just shared some really good examples of work that you've done where, you know, you've talked about alternatives to incarceration and what that looked like. How does that connect to abolition? And for people who might be new to that concept, could you try to give a definition of like what we mean when we talk about abolition? And then also, is it a new concept? I know I said it's been around for decades, but if you could dig into that a little bit, that would be great too. And again, whoever wants to start.
Go off when he says.
Well,
I was gonna say we could just keep the same order. Yeah, I can start a little bit. I think for me, I really, especially like learning that like from I've been fighting obviously deportation and been in and out of courts and like detention centers and prisons and jails and county jails and, you know, the whole thing. And like really being like, damn, if I would have never pled guilty, right, to like this charge, like I would have never been flagged for ICE. But that was my first introduction to the whole legal system. My first time being picked up at a probation office by ICE, like in plain dress clothes, picking me up, and I didn't come home for another 2 years. So I think for me, the way coming into abolition work was obviously living the experience, right? But it's like, for me, abolition really starts talking about the prison industrial complex, right? So immigration is part of the prison industrial complex. So we always hear kind of words of like PIC. And for me, I just want to shout out critical resistance, folks like with like survive and punishment, even a lot of like networks that organize around immigrant rights that are like at the intersections of criminal justice. I really appreciate like the Immigrant Justice Network always holding the line on criminal bars for anything, right? When we're talking about citizenship. But anyways, for me, that's how I started to come in understanding, right? That like, you know, no fighting the fighting cages, fighting mass incarceration is directly also related to like no policing, right? Like police are out there also hunting us, putting us there, you know, like all these things are super connected. And I think for me, abolition is, again, it's also a strategy around shrinking the power of the system, right? So when I always think of like, okay, what am I doing? And are these strategies actually shrinking the system, right? Taking power from the system. If it's a strategy that's helping decarcerate folks and bring them home, that's abolition work, right? If it's even sometimes there's like, and I know maybe other people might not think so, but like right now I think about like doing even prosecutor work, for example, even like working against judges, right? Like if it's like tackling the powers, right? If it's going after the powers, if it's shrinking, if it's weakening them, that's abolition work. So I just always appreciate even us fighting like casework, you know. I've been like, I know that like I come from like, you know, folks that have helped me that came from experiencing like the Not One More deportation movement, right? Back then when it's like they've learned that it's hard to fight individual cases. But I'm like, for me, I'm like, well, I have this case and I need people to hear about my case and I need to keep sharing my story because it's going to also shift policy culture, right, to one that's screaming abolishing ICE. But now we're hearing that it's important to use cases, individual cases, right, to do that storytelling, right, to do that work. And I don't know, I think I'm going into a different little route, but I think for me, I was just introduced through all of this, right? You know, learning from Black organizers, right? The abolition work, because they center all of us or none, while the immigrant rights movement has kind of been like shifting and freaking out about the good and bad immigrant and accepting criminal bars and wanting citizenship, knowing that criminalization will still be there. So anyways, just wanted to shout out abolition. I hope that I was able to introduce a little bit of it, but I know Eunisses is going to talk a little bit more. So gracias for that question, Marisa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ale. That was awesome. Definitely agree with everything you said. You know, to me, abolition it is the complete elimination of systems of surveillance, of policing, of incarceration, both the physical and the non-physical systems, because I think that a big piece of abolition is also recognizing internal systems of oppression and the mindsets that, you know, so much of our socialization has set us up to basically reenact and reinforce systems of oppression. And so getting rid of those is not just getting rid of prisons. It's not just defunding police and ending ICE and all of the really kind of physical, tangible examples of it, but it's looking really deep into ourselves, into our communities, and figuring out where did these internal systems of oppression come from and how are we perpetuating them amongst ourselves, within our families, in our schools. You know, I think that when we talk about abolition, we need to figure out how to end methods of walking around this world that hurt other people. And that will lead to the deconstruction and dismantlement of something really physical like prisons. But there are so many cages in our own hearts and in our minds that we have to also contend with. And we can't do that alone. And so abolition is spending more time in community, getting into the messiness of it, because this is not easy work. It's not fast work. It's really, really hard, and it needs the time and space to be done right. And so that's all part of it as well, is let's shift away from these ideas for measuring success and measuring outcomes and just measuring period, because those are also forms of oppression, right? Like, what does it mean to have a successful RJ program? We can't constantly rely on, oh, this is how many cases go into, you know, a program. This is the recidivism rates, all of that. Like, those are all perpetuations of systems of oppression that need to go as part of abolition. And so how do we begin to see success as the collective healing of communities? Because again, even this idea of us versus them, of win versus loss, of anything that exists in a really narrow sort of dynamic, also needs to go. And so how do we walk through this world figuring out, you know, how do we basically move through this world in ways that allow us to heal and that give opportunities to everyone around us to heal? Because if we're addressing issues and fixing things and making things better in one place, but not in another, or another is suffering because we're concentrating in one area, then that's not an abolition. That's really just shifting the lens so that the view is nicer. And so that's to me, it's a big combination of the physical, the emotional, the mental, the collective, the societal, the social, and all of the cages that we need to get rid of. I'll pass it to you, Eunisses.
Thank you. And I 100% agree with Sandra and Ale. And to add that, you know, these are not concepts that are decades away from now or generations away from now. Like, these are concepts that we are applying currently, especially to our policy development, our campaign development, and strategy development. And so for us, it's like even starting at the most basic, like when deciding when to move forward with a policy or a decision, is it going to leave anybody behind? Is this policy or decision going to build something we'll have to destroy in the future? Is this policy or decision going to give more money and more power to the systems that are harming and we're trying to dismantle? If it's yes to any of those questions, then we have to go back to the drawing table. And we do that. That's what we've done in LA County. That's how we stopped a $3.5 billion jail plan, and we're able to move millions of dollars destined for jail money for construction back into community, because it was community money that was going to pay for these jails. You know, because throughout that jail fight, we were told, okay, instead of 4,800 jail beds, how about we just do 3,000 jail beds? Okay, instead of building a women's jail and a jail for people with mental health needs, we're not going to build the women's jail, and we're just going to build a mental health treatment facility, aka a jail with a different name. And at all of those points, the system was telling us this is the best that we can give you. And we just kept going back to the drawing board, not compromising, because we're not going to leave anybody behind. We're not going to build something we'll have to destroy in the future. We're not going to put more money and more power into these systems, right? And so we were able to get to a point where we invested so much labor in convincing the bureaucracy and providing examples of like, look, these are the things that we can do. This is what you need to invest in. And that is abolition, because we canceled the contract. We moved money out of the system, and we didn't say, okay, incarcerate people with mental health needs and let's keep it pushing. It's like, no, we're not going to keep building cages for people. We need to build pathways for people so we can get people out of the cages and actually invest in a system of care. So I wanted to give that example of like, look, like when we talk about abolition, we're not talking about pie in the sky, even though the system is going to try to tell us that that is not possible, that is not practical. It very much is, but it just requires us to do a lot more labor and a lot more political education to try to change the minds of the systems and people.
That's actually a perfect segue into the next question, because sometimes the immediate response when we talk about these alternatives is, well, what do we do about, you know, the people who are quote unquote committing violent crime? So what would be your response to that? In an abolitionist world, how do we hold people and also institutions accountable in ways that don't replicate these systems, and ways that don't replicate state violence? And again, anybody.
Yeah. Hey, everybody, Alejandra again. I mean, it makes me just think of like, damn, like what's really violent, right? I always want to talk about that, right? Because I'm just like I be hell always talking about like muerte a la migra, you know, and everybody's like, I know that's a lot, you know, and I'm like, well, why not? Like, right, like let's talk about it, right? Like these family separation, or like even enforcement at the border, or cages, right? Like kill us every day. Like we're not the violent ones, right? So it would be like, you know, talking about poverty being violence, right? Talking about family separation being violent, yeah. McKinney, right? Talking about like this like PTS trauma, right? Barriers when you come out, when you're formerly incarcerated, coming home, can access nothing, right? What does dignity really look like for felons, right? For people that are marked non-citizens for the rest of their lives, right? Which was related to the comment I said, like, I want to reimagine like dignity for people outside of citizenship, right? Only like certain kinds of people really deserve, right, dignity and respect and autonomy and self-determination. So I just think about that, and I think I said the best way to really hold people I made a note. I prepped for this. How do we hold people in the institutions accountable without being like again, like replicating state violence? I'm just again defunding them. We have to defund them. Just such a capitalistic world, right? They have all the money. Again, that's the way that the one clear way I really appreciate, like the network, Detention Watch Network, doing a lot of defunding ICE work, which again, defunding to really abolish till we don't need them, right? Till we shifted policy to bring investment to us. And again, obviously we speaking about abolition work, and I think a lot around taking power, right, from them, right? I think about a lot of sometimes when we ask for policemen to be arrested. And again, impacted families should want whatever they want to happen. But sometimes for me, I'm like, I just want to watch them never, ever have power to be in a police uniform again. Right. Or, you know, again, like, how do we stop the harm from actually happening again? And sure, there's going to be other cops, right? That's why an arrest, it doesn't really matter and so forth. But, or we have to abolish police, period, is the real answer. But definitely, I think consequences, right? We also, even if people are going to, you know, again, be held accountable for harm, we don't want them to go and like, you know, be tortured and fucking like dying in cages, right? Or again, not having the basic needs. So I think that's the way that we kind of think about accountability as a student of abolition. And again, just always like recreating outside of this, of the thing, the crumbs that they're giving us, you know? So I'll just pass it on to Sandra.
Yeah, all of that. I mean, all of that times infinity. And I think especially with people that have caused harm, I think we do what the opposite of what the system does, which is the system ostracizes, the system invisibilizes. It pushes people that have caused especially violent harm out of their communities. It removes them and it disappears them. And what needs to happen is that we need to bring them in closer. When we cause harm, if you think back on being very young and causing harm as a child, as a kid, usually, and I really turn to watching children and learning from young people, because I'm going to repeat this many times, but aside from the reimagining, there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen and a lot of remembering. And so thinking back, when we cause harm as children, the first thing that most young people do is that they turn to someone that will be okay with them despite what they just did. And that doesn't go away. That human need for connection, for someone to look you in the eye and say, you know what? I still love you and I still believe in you. That's what we need to do when people cause harm. And the more serious the harm, the more they need to be brought in, the more folks need to love on them and wrap around them and be with them, the longer, the more intense that needs to be, the more community. And so because we have a system in place that does the absolute opposite, I mean, it completely dehumanizes people when they cause harm. And the more violent the harm is, the more dehumanization they have to go through. Then that's how we get here, right? That's how we get to such a broken and fragmented way of being when harm happens. And so we just need to flip that. And that can happen now. You know, that can happen the moment that you catch yourself with that knee-jerk reaction of like rejecting someone, cutting somebody out of your life when they mess up. Try the opposite. Try the opposite and see how that feels, and do it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more every day. And that to me is one of the ways, one of the most important ways to hold people accountable and to go through healing in a compassionate and, you know, basically liberating way when harm happens. And with systems, I can't agree with you more, Ale, defund them. I mean, that power needs to be shifted into directly impacted people. The power to heal needs to live within the folks that experience, that cause the harm, in the communities where the harm happens, not in systems outside of it. Pass it to you, Eunisses.
Thank you. And just to say, like, when policy is written, I agree with both of y'all what you're saying. When policy is written, it's written in the policy to punish, to incarcerate for these long sentences. We could write into policy transformative justice, restorative justice. You know, we will do that, and we're going to push for that. But that's why we exist in this dynamic, right? It's not something that Mother Nature created that we, you know, can't break out of. It's literally, you know, policies written on paper and systems that we have to break down. But when we talk about like what to do with like violence and harm, like think about where we are right now. I said it earlier. You know, when you call 911 usually for help, like I've called 911, the harm has already been done. You know, the crisis has happened. And even then when you call and they show up, like in my case, they didn't even get out of their cop car, you know? And so these current systems don't keep us safe. These current systems don't put you together after you've been harmed, right? Even when you're seeking resources, like monetary resources, you have to go through the DA's office and put a conviction on someone to get resources. And so systems keep reinforcing punishment, but they don't reinforce healing and support on both ends of, you know, the person who has been harmed and the person who is harmed. And so we really have to build towards a system where, you know, the person who has been harmed gets healing, gets safety, gets the support that they need to get to a place where they feel better. And also the person who has harmed, we need to make sure that they get to a place where their behavior has changed, where they will not do this again. And then also we need to take a step and look at the like situation and landscape that we're in. What existed in this situation and landscape that led to this situation occurring, to this harm happening? How do we change these landscapes and situations so that we're not creating spaces or opportunities for violence? And we need to invest more in violence interruption. And there are examples all over this country, in the Bay Area, in DC, of different types of programs where it's community responses, where community has gone together. They've developed a series of values and responses when things happen, and they come through for each other. And I could put some of the links on there. And so it's about investing in that, right? We're not talking about recreating things, or, I mean, even inventing new things. Like our communities, like people in the chat have been saying, have been doing this for decades internally without any resources and mutual aid. And so it really is, when we talk about defunding, yes, it is because we need to move resources into other responses. And this is because these responses haven't been working. So it's not even about investing, right? Because we need to invest, but it's about taking the responsibility and the power and the budgets from these harmful departments and systems so our people start getting sucked into them.
So I'm going to turn to just individual questions for each of you for this round, starting with Sandra. You talked a little bit about restorative justice to us already. What are shortcomings that come with that approach? Especially as, you know, we talk about abolition and the need to work outside of the system.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll start by saying that, you know, RJ is definitely first and foremost about relationships. So, you know, how to make them, how to maintain them, and then how to mend them when things go wrong. And what I've definitely seen as a shortcoming is that, unlike something like transformative justice, that is a political framework as much as it is an alternative to incarceration and a way of responding to harm that's community-based, restorative justice doesn't inherently have a political framework of abolition. And we see that because there are RJ programs that exist within institutions, within systems, or, you know, are working in partnerships with them, not necessarily en route to moving away from those partnerships and being community-based, but maybe more, you know, along the lines of figuring out how systems can become more restorative. And I can't say this enough, but restorative justice can never and should never be about humanizing systems. Restorative justice needs to be about desystematizing humans. And so in that regard, we need to practice RJ. We need to honor its roots in indigenous practices, its roots in, you know, the Mennonite community. We need to honor its roots en route to having RJ exist fully outside of systems. And so that means there shouldn't be RJ units in DA's offices. There shouldn't be, you know, conversations on how to make policing more restorative. There's nothing restorative about policing. They're literally polar opposite words. There need to be real conversations on what you mentioned earlier of like, what are we restoring? Restore to what, right? Because restorative justice is about seeking wholeness for individuals and communities. It's about seeking collective wholeness, not about trying to go back to a time in the past where maybe things were better or before something happened. It's honoring that something happened and figuring out how we can move forward, being whole together. And so in that regard, I think the biggest shortcoming, in short, of all of that is RJ, you know, and its relationship to systems.
Thank you. Ale, this next one is for you. What are the connections between abolishing these current systems, like immigration enforcement, and the free movement of people? So how is abolition connected to the free movement of people?
Yeah. How is abolition? Thank you. I'm connected to the free movement of people. Yeah, so the freedom of movement of people and abolition. You know, it makes me think of like when I try to, do pass like or work on federal legislation around immigration too, around like dismantling and weakening the deportation machine. And we have a bill called the New Way Forward. And it really like takes like just kind of eliminates these pieces, right, of the 96 immigration laws, the way that we've distorted criminal justice laws to like impact immigrants, non-citizens double, right, like mandatory detention, mandatory deportation, criminalizing reentry and stuff like that. But I talked to people, like members of Congress from Arizona, and I'm like, hey, like, the New Way Forward, and would you sponsor it, right? We would have some targets in Arizona. And he was like, no, this is a free borders, a free open borders bill. And I'm just like, wait, what? What is he talking about, right? Because again, we try to polarize people also so much in immigration, and I think about like, okay, open borders, what's so wrong with that then, right? Because like white people already have freedom of movement, right? They already live in an abolitionist world, like some of us mentioned, right? They only call the police when they need anything, right? They don't have cops in their grocery stores, right? They don't have cops in their middle schools. I grew up in middle school with kids being on ankle monitors. You know what I mean? Like they've been training us, right, for this like mass incarceration, punitive like world, right? That's our only like solution to anything, right? That's where we're gonna put everyone away. So I just think of like, yeah, I mean, freedom of movement, abolition work is exactly that, right? It's just a freedom to move. I even think about abortion work, right? Autonomy, like actually making decisions over my own life, over my own production, over my own sexuality, all of those things that are like, again, racialized or that are politicized through cages, right? Through incarceration. I just, all those things are connected to me. I think of like freedom of speech, even right now in Arizona, giving protesters like felonies for protesting, right? Like all of that too is there to block us from moving, right? From moving. And when we think about immigration, right? Even thinking about people being able to, when the U.S. is literally participating in NAFTA, for example, that's actually gonna like, take away jobs, right, from farmers, and a lot of Mexicans had to move up north, right? And then we welcome them with more cages and prisons, right? When we're literally putting more investment in corporations, right, and profit than in people, So I think again, the immigration enforcement or piece just has to be abolished, period. ICE has to be, there's no reason why immigration and customs enforcement exist. They're only here to deport, target, and incarcerate, right? So to me, it's talking about self-determination. It's talking about power. It's talking about even like language access, right? Like we can't know that certain freedoms exist. For example, we talk about abortion clinics, right? An abortion clinic can have free abortions, but if we don't know about it, right, if we're not, again, equalizing power and like people being able to communicate or learning things in their language, like, I don't know, I think all of these things are just super, super connected. So I really appreciate this question. And again, I think for me, freedom of movement is why we do this work, freedom to remain as well, right, where you want to, which all of it, again, is talking about the root of family, like, talking about family separation and stuff like that. But yeah, I think I'll pass it on with that to Eunisses. Or I think there's a different question. My bad.
Yeah, thanks, Ale. So I'm going to pitch one question to Eunisses, and then I do want to hear from the audience. So if the audience has questions, please do drop it in the question and answer chat, or else just a chat. Drop it in the chat, and we'll try to get to your question. And then after that, I'll have one more question for all of our panelists. But Eunisses, you sort of touched on this earlier, but as for people who work in policy, whether you're a policy advocate or a lawmaker or policy adjacent, what are some questions that you should be asking yourself? I mean, because first of all, having that position is a position of power. So how can people use their positions of power and influence to build an abolitionist world like we've talked about today? What questions should they be asking themselves?
Thank you for that question, Maritza, and I 100% agree with you, Ale and Sandra. Thank you for just allowing me to join this amazing panel of badass femmes. I just want to take a pause to do that. But, I mentioned these 3 questions, right? Are we leaving anybody behind? Are we building something we'll have to destroy in the future? And are we putting more money and more power into that system? Basic questions. Definitely ask yourselves that at any decision-making point and policy-making point, right? But we have to go deeper than that too, because a lot of that is on the other side is finding the solutions. It's finding, okay, if not that, then what else? And again, a lot of the times is like, we're not recreating the carceral system, but we do need to invest in our communities. We do need different responses that are life affirming, that are going to support us. And that's also means that we have to be strategic, that we have to bring a finesse with that. And so another question is, okay, what are these solutions? How are we going to close down Men's Central Jail when at least $150 million goes to paying for the salaries of the people that work there for 1 year, all those jobs? And so the question is, okay, the solutions. And one example I want to bring is like, ask yourselves, what are other movements doing that is successful in dismantling their harmful systems? And so environmental justice, they have a policy called just transition, transitioning bad jobs, oil jobs, into green jobs, into jobs that remediate the land, that create green spaces for our communities. And so, yes, ask yourselves those questions, those 3 questions. And if it's, if you're leaving people behind or building things others join the future or putting more money and more power, go back to the drawing table, do as much as you can not to compromise so you don't leave people behind in all the things. But also, in order for you, one of the tools in order for you not to have to compromise is to build your own solutions, because the systems will not build them for you. And the solutions they will come up with are going to be horrible, are going to be carceral, are going to be, copies and mirrors of what they've already done for decades. So ask yourselves those questions. If not this, then what is the solution that I can bring to the table?
Great. And then we have 2 questions. The first from Carolina, who's joining us. How do we shrink the power of the prison industrial complex while changing public opinion in order to maintain long-term change? So again, how do we shrink the power of the prison industrial complex while changing public opinion in order to maintain long-term change? I think that's a good question too, because as Ale said, like, these conversations can be really polarizing, particularly at, the time in history that we're at now. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I love the work of the Black Mama bailout, right? I don't know if y'all know about the work of the national bailout work, obviously led by Black femmes. Shout outs to Janae. I will always love her for teaching me so much in the DC, Maryland area. But I think talking about how people are being incarcerated even for $25, right? That's like the severity of shit for Black people in DC. And they were doing a lot of narrative storytelling, joyful campaigns around bailing folks out, right? And I think their quote, even their motto, I don't know what that means or what the word is, but it's like, money kept them in, love brought them home, right? And I think those are the kinds of campaigns that we need, that are like that kind of speak to the heart of everything, right? That kind of get you at the gut, right? That kind of, you have to kind of join that movement, and even again, raising funds and keeping track of why the community was also being jailed, right? And using that, right, to talk about what we need to do, to talk about the actual needs that we have, to talk about the investment that we need, right? I think, and then bringing people out, right? Bringing people out. You're not filling these quotas with our loved ones, right? You're not filling these bed quotas with our loved ones, right? We're going to be there, right there to bring people home, right? And they did a lot of fundraising and organizing, and I remember even using a theater play to talk about policing and surveillance, to fundraise at people's homes. So we were having very intimate conversations with very small pockets, right? And help, and even through this organizing, allowing folks to organize their own communities. So I think that's how we just shrink. Again, we just shrink the power, and we keep building like-minded people. We keep building abolitionists. I wasn't born an abolitionist either, kind of, right? Like, so kind of like, really like organizing amongst people and shrinking that power. And again, doing campaign work, organizing to again take power away from them. And I think the bail movement is really important. I'll pass it on because I can talk about other stuff, but
I'm going to jump in real quick because there's a second question that's related to the first question. So that way you guys can speak to both. It's totally related though. The next question was, I see a move for alternative community programs in criminal justice in metropolitan areas, but what are your thoughts, wisdoms about CJ reform in rural areas? And the reason I think those questions are connected, because it sounds like it's a conversation about winning over hearts and minds. And there has been more progress in urban areas versus rural areas. So just wanted to jump in with that question because again, it's related to how do we reach people and change public opinion to get rid of the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, I mean, I think What are your thoughts about CG reform? So yeah, again, being super mindful of like around reforms, right? Just like we're being mindful also about not co-opting things, right? Because I think sometimes reformist strategies, which they're still so important, at the same time. So just again, being mindful of like reform versus abolition strategies, right? Are we going to have to dismantle this later type of thing? What Eunisses were saying earlier. But I think right now the biggest thing that I can think of and share right now to alternatives to we see alternative community programs is that we are shifting incarceration to the crib, to our homes. You know what I'm saying? Like even core civic, CCA, it used to be, right? That's like a big incarcerator of immigrant people. They're also they changed their name from CCA, which is like Corporation Correction something to like core civic, right? Because they want to get to our hearts and mind that they're actually doing something well, right? And now they're going to also own and privatize post rehabilitation, right? They're going to also supervise when you go home, right? So now we're even like checking in all these alternatives, right, to like incarcerating you in a cage. And I don't know if that's exactly what this Lorena was referring to, but I think that's what came to mind right now, because we're doing a lot of like more digitized incarceration, right? I have folks I'm helping create their deportation campaigns that check in over a camera, right, over a phone, thinking around like the smart wall, right? So I don't know, we just have to be very mindful, and we have to again learn from the past.
Eunisses and Sandra, I think you guys were going to jump in, it looked like.
Oh, I can speak. Well, let's keep going the order. Go ahead, Sandra.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I mean, the first thing that I thought of, which is a combination answer to those two questions, is that we get out and we talk to each other a whole lot more. I think that part of what exists in cities is a lot more organizing. It's a lot more opportunities for folks to come together. And so just doing that more and more in our communities, and doing it in a way that is centered around the voices of those that are directly impacted by all of these systems that we're trying to dismantle. And doing it in a way that like it's not just centered, it's meant to like uplift and like really move directly affected, system impacted folks into positions of leadership, into positions of decision making, and so on and so forth. And so really having like a leadership development pipeline attached to all of these conversations that are happening in community, because that is how we build power. In doing so, we're reclaiming power that currently is in systems, and so we're showing up with a base of people with lived experience that they're fighting for the change that they need to see in their own lives. It's not happening outside of them. And I'll stop there.
100% agree again with both these amazing panelists. And if I could just add two pieces, one is the media. And here in LA, there's talks of a crime wave. There's talks about, violence is skyrocketing and all these things, when LAPD data shows otherwise. But when we take a step back, you look at the actual LAPD and the sheriff's department, they probably have a combined social media department and comms department of over like 60 to 80 people. And so when you look at the articles around crime waves, when you look at the articles that actually are shifting and fear-mongering people towards a more conservative perspective on criminal justice, it's because they're able to influence the narrative in that way. And so you look at the associations being quoted, you look at law enforcement being quoted. And so that's a big deal. And that's a big piece of, what people think about. And what happens in one news media usually gets transported into others. And then you start seeing TV, news about violence and all the things. So I would say, like, as organizers and as foundations, if you're like supporting organizers, fund the comms and media work. Like, there's just not enough work and not enough capacity that we have to be able to shift the narrative in a way that law enforcement special interest groups have, and we need more of that. And then this, the second piece was going to be around talking about the data around Ale, talking about how do we shift, like, what we need. So, and especially shifting away from like the prison industrial complex in LA County in 2016, one of the top charges that had women in the jail was driving with a suspended license and no license. And so when we think about, okay, how do we break the prison industrial complex? It's like, okay, like repeal the law that's criminalizing people for not having a license or driving with a suspended license. People will not be criminalized for that. And we're working towards that, but it's like using these narratives, using this information to build policies and responses that fit your area. Because the thing about rural communities is that those responses might be even your alternative to incarceration might look different from ours, but we just got to be a web, a connection. A lot of the programs that have been transformative in LA County, we did not come up with them here. The system didn't. We brought them from places like Seattle. We brought them from places like the South. And so don't be afraid to connect with people that you meet to like learn from them. Because again, you don't have to recreate the wheel. Folks have been doing this, and there's data. There's actual proven methods that work. So just know that you can feel confident in that.
Thanks everyone for your awesome answers throughout this panel.
This is why Eunisses is your next city LA council member.
Well, we do have more questions, but we don't have more time, unfortunately. This was such a great discussion, but we do have to close it. And I do want to remind people that if this was a conversation that you felt passionately about, we have a breakout session that's starting now around this topic, reimagining systems of enforcement, which, as Ale pointed out, probably not the best title, but you get what we're talking about. So I would encourage you to join that breakout session that's starting now if you want to continue the conversation. And to our wonderful panelists, thank you so much. This was a really brilliant, energizing conversation. Really appreciate you all being here.
Yeah, thank you both. I learned so much from y'all. Bye, Marita.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's an
I
honor.
love y'all. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.